Hello, BookTube. It's a blah, dreary day here. Heavy, low-hanging gray clouds, chilly air, no excitement whatsoever. My little bean is blah. I am blah. Uh, so it was a perfect time for a little pick-me-up in the form of a uh, let me know video from Kevin Toll at Kevin Toll Reads. I'll leave a link to the video that I'm talking about down below. This is a series of videos that he does, the let me know videos, where he just asks a question, and he's not asking with any kind of agenda. He just wants to stir up conversation. And the let me know question that he asked just recently really strikes to the heart for me. It really has the potential to pick up a blah day, and that is: are the classics still relevant today? I'm sure that you've seen a variation of this question many times before, and as usual with such questions, we have to define our terms, especially the term classic, which has at least two definitions on BookTube, as I learned years and years ago when I first started watching BookTube. My initial idea of classics, the one that I came to BookTube with, the one that I have been trained in since time immemorial to recognize, is the classics of ancient Greece and Rome. The thing you could get a degree in, that's what you'd be talking about. You'd be talking about the classics of ancient Greece and Rome. But I have learned that the word is elastic, like most words, and that it can apply to a number of different things. For instance, in his video, Kevin Toll uses it to apply to the cornerstone, the holotype, foundational works of specific genres. For instance, he mentions that in the Western genre, Louis L'Amour is a classic. He's a classic author. That dovetails rather well with another definition, another modern, later definition of classics, a non-Greece and Rome definition of classics that a friend of mine used to use forever and ever in his classes, which was a classic in that sense, is any book that still works on non-overlapping generations. So it works on its first generation, and then 4 generations later, when the first generation is all dead, it still works. And I like that too, because that takes into account fads. That takes into account the zeitgeist of the moment, where a book could take off and could be really popular, and it is nevertheless unreadably awful. Or not at all. It does not at all have that peculiar ability to survive time that we associate with classics, right? The element of classics, one of the elements of classics that we give it, I think the defining element, is the ability to survive time. Meaning that for good or ill, your book critics today, your professional paid up due members of the book chat world, the one thing they cannot do is declare a book a classic. They all do. I've done it myself. They all say instant classic. Most of them, I've tried it myself, will have the circumspection to say deserves to be a classic. But the one thing they can't know is how that book will survive over time. All they can do is report on what it is at the moment. When a classic is in large part defined by how it survives over time, by whether or not it survives over time. So the tried and true way to illustrate this is to take some book from non-overlapping generations, some book long enough ago so that when it first came out, no one is still alive, but it was a hit with those people, with those readers. Take some book like that and see whether or not it lives today, whether or not it is, to use Kevin's word, relevant today. And we'll get back to relevant. You can use all sorts of examples of this, and some of them will be from writers that you know, from writers that are famous. Like, for instance, a book called Satan's Toe is utterly inert. It is utterly dead. It speaks to a whole bunch of issues in its day. People read it with interest and even reviewed it with interest in its day, but it is completely dead. It is a completely inert book. It will not speak to any generation but its own. But that author wrote Last of the Mohicans, which does speak. So you never know quite how that's going to work. You can't ever quite call it. Like, for instance, once upon a time, there was a novel called The Sheikh, a turbaned desert warrior. And everybody in the English-speaking world read that book. Everybody read it. Everybody loved it. Everybody knew about it. And it's completely dead today. And not just from happenstance. If somebody reprinted it, bricks would be thrown at it. It is a bad book. It just hit the zeitgeist at the right moment. There are plenty of books like that. And that always makes me a little wary, just a little wary of using the term classic in the way that Kevin Toll uses it. Because Louis L'Amour, if you had asked him, when he was writing his Westerns, if you had asked him for a classic Western author, he would have named 2 or 3, and they aren't read anymore. So we don't know for sure that he will be read. I think probably he will. His books have staying power. But for one reason or another, whether it's a good thing to measure or estimate or esteem, or a bad one, that ability to live through the generations is a hallmark of a classic. So that's I guess if we're going to define our terms, that's what we would say for this. Let me know. It won't. Unfortunately, it won't be my oldest friends. The classic, the real classics, the classics with a capital C, the classics of ancient Greece and Rome are my oldest friends. I know them backwards and forwards. I love them dearly. But there are later classics. Certainly, I would be the king of all pedants not to refer to Pride and Prejudice or War and Peace as classics. So, if we adopt a looser definition than I'm inclined to myself, and use Kevin's definition, where any book that has survived over a significant length of time, so outside of the readership of its own original publication, that's a fair enough accomplishment on its own. I'd be willing to bet that of all the roughly 300,000 new books printed in the United States in 2025, I'd be willing to bet that probably 2 books out of 300,000 will actually manage that. Look at the so-called literary fiction swill that comes out from every major publisher in the United States every month. Look at all of it. I won't name any names, but if you go to your retail bookstore, you'll know what I mean. If you listen to enough BookTube videos from the bigger channels, you'll see what I mean. It's slop. It's absolutely awful. No one will remember it. I had a vivid reminder of this the other day because the Brattle Bookshop, my used bookstore here in Boston, has recently bought an enormous collection of such work. Someone who just filled a gigantic storage warehouse with thousands of paperbacks of, you name it, the last 6 novels of Jane Smiley, all the thrillers of Tana French, every Nick Tosches book, all of it, all the literary darlings that the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal have talked about, all the ones where they come down the pike 2 years ago, 3 years ago, everybody feels like, all right, well, this is the phenom of the moment. We all have to write about this. And where is it now? Where is it now? Take gigantic examples. We won't even take gigantic examples that won their author, live independently for the rest of your life money, and no one's ever even heard of them. I could do that, but like debuts of years past. But what about, for instance, a debut that everybody has heard of, City on Fire by Garth Wist Hallberg? Who reads it now? Who reads the last 4 novels that John Irving wrote? They show up, the book chat world has to pay them attention, and then they go away. No one's ever going to reprint them. No one's ever going to put them in the Library of America. No one's ever going to teach them in classes. No one's ever going to study them in any kind of school or tradition. They're just gone. They came and they're gone. That book collection currently making its debut on the Brattle Sale Shop really shook me for a minute. I don't do really shook for very long, but it really shook me for a minute because I saw my own profession. I saw my own activity, not only in the last 15 years, but in the distant past when I reviewed books then. I was doing the same thing. Some extremely niche historical novel that no one's going to read, barely has any printing at all, but you read it and you think this is really good. No editor's going to pay you to review that. It's going to come into the world and sink without a stone, sink without a ripple. Is that book a classic? Well, you don't 100% know. It is possible that the one extra axis, time, will take it up and remember it. You can't always see that coming. I know that the usual vectors are school. School is by far the best vector. Is it taught in schools? That means it will probably get classic status. But that's not the only one, and you can never see it coming. Sometimes it's the campaign of one person or a couple of editors that suddenly foist Dante studies in English back into the forefront, or that suddenly make a literary superstar out of Herman Melville for Moby Dick, where the generation before that never even thought about it, would read it, maybe knew about it, but would not have considered it the great American novel. You don't know. You don't know the qualities that will make that happen. So one of the objective qualities that we can use to at least define the term is something that speaks to non-overlapping generations. But that raises definitional questions of its own, because that speaks to part needs to be defined, and that connects with the word that Kevin uses in his video, which is relevant. Now, I want to argue that that relevance in terms of speaking to our present moment about our present moment is not only the least important element of any work of literature, but also irrelevant. It's the function of every generation to navel gaze, and looking for that kind of relevance. Like I'm reading Knickerbocker's History of New York by Washington Irving, and I want to know how relevant it is to social media. That kind of navel gazing I just hate. When I back a million years ago when I taught, I always cautioned my students against it, said it's the surefire sign of a bumbling amateur reader to look at literature through their own eyes, like that, through their own petty, narrow, of the moment concerns. Don't be that kind of reader. Not only are you making a fool of yourself if anyone sees you do it, but also you're depriving yourself of these works. Why do that? Why deprive yourself of something when all it takes is an attitude shift to fix that? Relevance can also be a trap because there are so many works of, for instance, my kind of classics of the ancient world, where one glance at them would tell you, well, okay, this isn't relevant. And the natural unspoken part of is this relevant is, if it's not, then it's not important. Then I don't need to read it. Then I'm not going to get anything out of it. I would argue dump the idea of relevance altogether. Some critics and some teachers have got around the idea of that kind of very specific, does it speak to my timeline, relevance by saying that classical works can be relevant to deeper human concerns. Okay, that is true, but that was almost always not anywhere in what the writer was doing, in their mind, in the actual effect of their work. So that also feels a little bit anachronistic. That also feels a little bit like you're mapping your concerns onto a book, rather than letting the book do to you what it has done to previous generations of its readers. But if we take if you take the first definition of relevance, how does it speak to social media? What does it have to do with the fascist takeover of a free country? What does it have to do with egg prices? Well, then you're lost. Then you're stuck in the bubble of the books that are in your own time, whose ink is still wet. So let's get rid. We can at least get rid of that idea. Well, how is this relevant to TikTok? And go with the other kind of relevance, the pedagogical kind of relevance, where is it relevant to the human condition? I hate phrases like this. Sorry to break out laughing. But I taught students to mock these kinds of bloviating generalities. I taught them to mock them. Don't pay attention. Don't do anything like that, and laugh at the people who do, because they are leaving something out of the equation when they do that. When you bloviate like that about how does this speak to man's inhumanity to man, you're leaving something out of that equation, and it's pretty important. You're leaving out the book in question. Look at the book in question. What is it doing, and how well is it doing it? Is it doing what it's doing well enough to speak to non-overlapping generations of readers outside of school? Outside of any compulsion, outside of relevance, is it doing what it's doing well enough to speak to them? And I think that you'll find that it does. That classics tend to do that. That tends to be their strength. Remember the age-old quote: "Many books are unjustly forgotten, but no book is unjustly remembered." Uh, and when it comes to those kinds of classics, once we dump the first kind of relevance, and I would argue, no offense to Kevin Toll, I would argue dump any idea of relevance. Once we do that, then we're confronted with the works themselves. We can't dump both of them, so we'll stick with just the second one. But once you're confronted with the works themselves, then I think you see a couple of the real reasons why classics are relevant, if we're going to use that term. One is that they actually do speak to overriding, underlying human concerns. The passion, the exaltation, the recklessness, and the terror of war are fully present in Homer's Iliad. They're absolutely fully present there. Any halfway decent English language translation will bring them out to you, and the Greek is harrowing. They are fully present in Shakespeare. And so on down the line. For instance, there are innumerable examples. Like, for instance, well, sticking with the Iliad, not only when you read that are you shocked and horrified, you are taken to war. It's stupidness, it's pig-headedness, it's glories, it's gore. You are taken to war in the Iliad. But not only that, you also become part of its own tradition. Alexander the Great is a name that you know. And he took his copy of the Iliad to war with him, conquering 2/3 of the known world in his day. That he loved reading the Iliad. Now, the Iliad that he read was probably very different, and he loved it for reasons you would not recognize, but it is a thread. And it runs right throughout history. And only classics can do that. The works of the moment can't do that. Only classics gather moss as they move through time. That moss of readership, that moss of interconnectedness. And that can happen even recently. That is true even recently. What I would consider recent, books that Louis L'Amour he isn't quite 3 generations away from me. Let's just put it that way and be nice about it. But I can recognize his books have staying power. Or you could think of something like The Lord of the Rings, which is not taught in schools. It's not taught in high school and freshman college, where the status of classic is usually bestowed on a work. Like, for instance, Toni Morrison's Beloved would not in any circumstances, not anywhere in the reading world, be called a classic if it were not being taught. It was added to curricula. I believe right now in 2025 America, it is still on some school curricula. That will be not only non-existent, but illegal in very little time, in just a couple of years. But right now, I believe it is still on school curricula. Whether or not that speaks to the work itself, we don't know, because it hasn't been around long enough. I think my old friend was right. I think one of the best yardsticks, one of the best proving grounds for whether or not something is a classic is whether or not it speaks to non-overlapping generations. So something like Beloved by Toni Morrison, or I would argue most of Louis L'Amour, or even Lord of the Rings, haven't had a chance. We don't know. But you look at them and you think, there's a lot here that you don't need to be a student to appreciate, to love, for it to mean something to you. I think it's that feeling of reading something and thinking, all right, well, this is not only well executed, but it also feels deeper than that. It feels better than that. I think it's that feeling that leads critics and also readers, you can see it all over Goodreads and Amazon, to call a very contemporary book a classic. I think that's what does it. Or they will see the other idea of a classic is maybe that it is in some way a definitive word on its subject. Again, if we use the example of the Iliad, there are almost no books that capture war better than the Iliad, fiction or nonfiction. So you find a relatively contemporary book, in my mind certainly would be contemporary, you find a relatively contemporary book that looks like it's nailing its subject, and there's a strong temptation to call it a classic, like The World Without Us. That seems like a classic. You read it and you think, all right, not only is this good, not only is this well done, but it feels in a way like a final word on its subject. Or The Uninhabitable Earth, or even Cal Newport's Digital Minimalism. You read these books and you think, all right, well, that feels like a classic in its own way. uh, I distrust that because all three of those examples, for instance, those three examples, I could give plenty of others, are still relevant in all the senses of the word, including the senses I want us to discard. They do still speak to our current moment. So will they be curiosities? Will anyone read The Uninhabitable Earth in 200 years when the inhabitable parts of the earth look very different from what they do today? In 200 years, people are going to look at old maps and say, is it possible that people actually lived there once upon a time? Wow, that's amazing. That's just incredible. No one can live there anymore. There's no water, and the daytime average temperature is 150 degrees. So that's wild to think that once upon a time there were cities in Arizona. That's incredible. When that happens, I don't know that the Uninhabitable Earth will be a classic. I don't know that it'll be read. It will probably be more like Satan's Toe. It'll probably be more like a period piece. So you can't tell for sure what will be a classic in the modern era, and that's an element of this Let Me Know that I'm concentrating on because, I admit, of my profession. I am a book critic, and often the general reading public will think or even opine in Time magazine that the brief of a contemporary book critic is to call the classics. It's to look at that 300,000 ocean of new books and pick the classics. And it isn't. That isn't the job of a critic. That's the spiritual crisis that I had looking at all those classics of yesteryear, all those phenoms of yesteryear dumped at the Brattle Bookshop in their thousands. Totally forgotten, most of them destined for the dumpster. I just in the first few boxes that were opened, I think I saw 4 copies of Jane Smiley's novel 10 Days in the Hills. And whole bunches of other stuff. Richard Russo decides he's going to write a quick book. It gets a quick edit. It goes out into the bookstores. It's Richard Russo, so probably it will get talked about in critical circles. But it's a flyweight thing. A couple of critics will even call it that, and then it'll be gone. Now, is anyone under the impression now that make-weight book by Richard Russo is going to achieve any kind of status? I don't see how that illusion is possible when the make-weight books of Richard Russo characters, Richard Russo types from the previous generation, are forgotten. They are forgotten. Think about, well, to use some bait noirs, I think about John Updike. Think about all the make-weight novels that he wrote. That he was a big name while he was alive and able to keep his reputation alive, but those were the first books to go, and they won't be back. They won't be back. John Cheever, hate to say it, same way. Frank O'Hara, God help us. Look at all the make-weight books he wrote. He'll be remembered for one book, maybe one. And who knows if that will happen. That is not non-overlapping generations. That he might not be remembered even for Appointment in Samara. You look at something like that by Richard Russo and you realize, well, okay, it's appearing in the world and the book chat world has to pay attention to it, but it is effectively nothing. No one's going to want it. No one's going to remember it. No one's going to care about it. No one's going to reprint it. No one's going to teach it. Nothing. No one's ever going to find it buried in a library and use it as an inspiration for their own literary oeuvre. That's not going to happen. It's just a bubble of nothing. Naturally, that's the element of relevant that I'm concentrating on here. But I would argue that in addition to a deeper kind of relevance that classics have, that they definitely do have. So the answer to my let me know, my answer to this let me know is yeah, classics are relevant today, very, very much so. I don't talk about them on this channel as much as a large part of me sometimes wants to do. There's actually precious little that would feel more comfortable than me just teaching the classics on this channel. That's it. And not even the broader sense of the classics, just my classics. Just teach the classics on this channel. But I would argue that in addition to that broader definition of relevant, there's also another question to be added here. Keep in mind, I said the first kind of relevant the navel-gazing kind, the tapping the zeitgeist kind, the this is reflect my Twitter timeline. That kind of element needs to be forgotten. It is looking for that kind of thing is the act of a child. So once you are no longer a child, and keep in mind, I'm from the depths of the Cold War, so as far as I'm concerned, you're no longer a child when you're 10. Okay? You should start abandoning the stupidities of childhood fairly early on. But certainly when you're 15, you should not have any childish reactions like that anymore, where I'm picking up a book, a Court of Mists and Marigolds or whatever, and all I care about in this book is how it affects me personally, directly. Do the characters in the book remind me of classmates of mine at McKinley High School? That is a very childish way to read. So that kind of relevance, I want us all to just dismiss right away. No book needs to be that kind of relevant. No book should be, and no classic ever is. The broader kind of relevant is it speaking to deeper underlying themes. We can allow for that, and that would, I think, probably be the unifying thread that would connect most classics that Kevin would talk about, or that I would talk about, and someday we'll talk about it together on a video. But I would make one other argument to finish up here. I could go on forever on this subject. Most of the time when I taught classics, my kind of classics with a capital C, or lowercase c classics like Moby Dick or Hamlet, most of the time, a couple of early classes with the group were dedicated to hashing out this very subject. I'm not sure that I use the word relevant, but hashing out this very subject. Before we get into reading this thing and talking about it, why should you do that? Why would you want to do that? It was one of the first things that I hashed out, got everybody's opinions, got everybody talking. Of course, those early classes have to be a little theoretical anyway for me, because those were the classes where I was learning who needed to go. Those were when I was learning who needed to go. All right, I've got a room of 25 people here. You 3 people in this first class, this very first class, we're all talking to each other and introducing each other. Are you 3 people here mainly to get me to yell at you? Is that largely it? You're largely here just to disrupt, just to cut up. I want mean old Mr. Feeney to yell at me just because I get off on that, and I think maybe my 2 other friends will laugh at that. I needed a little bit of broad topic time in order to isolate those people, in order to figure out who they were, and then surprise the living daylights out of them by expelling them from the class. What? You can't do this. I have to take this class. It's mandatory. No, you don't. No. You go out of the class, or I leave the school. Just walk right out the door. You think the principal of this school is going to let me go for you? No. A, I don't trust you when you say that you'll behave yourself, and B, I don't want you here. Some of the rest of these people are indifferent to what I'm going to do. They don't think that anyone can ever make Moby Dick or Call of the Wild interesting to them. They're wrong about that. I can. Believe you me, I can. Unless you are a stone wall, I can make it interesting to you. Unless you're one of those 3 people that doesn't care whether or not I can make it interesting. You're just here to cut up. If that's true, you're gone. You're out. No, life is way too short to deal with the likes of them. But in addition to those early classes were also dedicated to hashing out, why are we doing this? And I would have some grousy people, some lazy students say, well, because I have to. And I'd say, no, not at all. Not at all. In a couple of classes, depending on what kind of program was being run, depending on what kind of supervision I was getting, I would tell my students, okay, if that's your answer, I'll pass you. You don't need to do anything. Don't need to read the work. You need to show up in class, obviously, because you'd be truant otherwise, but you don't need to do anything. You don't need to do the reading. You don't need to submit any papers or any works like that. When I call for a spot quiz or a spot discussion, I didn't like spot quizzes, but I'd often do spot discussions. You can just sit silent. If that's why you're here and you don't think you have any other option and that's the only thing you're saying, then fine. Just sit back there and don't participate. That shocked a lot of young people when I did that, but a lot of people in the class responded well. They heard that and thought, oh, wait, so this is voluntary. It is mandatory. I have to be in this class. I have to study this book. But it is voluntary. The teacher is saying that my participation is voluntary. That often made a huge amount of difference. A huge amount. I would tell the many, many eyes that suddenly lit up when I said that, I would tell them, not only are you going to want to participate, but you're going to end up liking this book. Parts of it, anyway. And oh boy, are you going to love our discussions. You, that group of people where you're saying arms crossed, eyes half closed, I'm just here because I have to be. Okay, fine. You're going to miss all of what we're going to do. So you just sit there, do what you want. And the rest of us will study this work. When I was doing, sorry, a little bit of memory lane there. When I was doing that kind of discussion about relevance, the main point I made was to dismiss with relevance altogether. Just get rid of it and look at the works themselves. But in those classes, I had a few wannabe writers, a few aspiring writers, some of whom went on to write. And there's no denying the allure of that term classic for aspiring writers. Most writers, at least today, are just generating slop. All they care about is whether or not they're getting their paltry slave wages check from their publisher. They don't care about anything more than that. But every once in a while, you'll get someone who's thinking, well, it'd be really nice if I were read in non-overlapping generations. I won't be around to see it, but I would like that feeling. No author ever knows. No author ever knows. They might be as sure as could be, but they never know. Not for sure. J.K. Rowling. Maybe at some points in the peak of her career, she could have thought, well, I did it. I entered a character into the zeitgeist. People will be reading my Harry Potter books in 100 years, long after I'm gone. Plenty of children's book authors have thought that, and it hasn't been true. And plenty of children's books authors haven't thought that, and it has been true. I guarantee you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the author of Charlotte's Web did not think that he was writing a masterpiece, an immortal masterpiece. The author of The Velveteen Rabbit did, but that's another story altogether. But anyway, so that allure of immortality can lead some writers on. Certainly in the short term, writing is the only thing that will do it, almost the only thing that will do it. If you become famous in some other way, that's extremely rare, but you can achieve a measure of immortality with writing. Actually, it's the hardest thing in the world to do, but it is still easier than achieving immortality any other way. And some people know that. So the idea of not the cheap kind of relevance, but the deeper kind of relevance really works on them. They want to write a book like that. I actually think, to get back to one of our innumerable examples here, I actually think that the young author of City on Fire was trying to do that. In some places, I think it's pretty obvious in the book. And other books as well. Doc Snooper Report, I think, is trying to do that. It is as topical as it could be. It seems like Doc Snooper Report is going straight for the first kind of relevance, talking only about your Twitter feed. But I think there's more going on there. I think it's also trying to map out the inner conversations of a generation, which will definitely be of interest to generations other than that generation. But anyway, now I am getting into the weeds here. So let's just wrap up this. Let me know, and of course I echo Kevin Toll. I also want to know what you think of this. Not so much the first kind of relevance of classics. No book should ever be held to that standard, and it's a dumb standard anyway. But the other kind of relevance. Like, for instance, Kevin, rather charmingly in his video, he asked this question, are classics still relevant? Even though he admits in his video, rather charmingly, that he has very little experience with classics, which is, I think, rather refreshing. I love the books that he talks about on his channel. They don't get talked about on most of the rest of BookTube, so that's fit. And yet they're the books that a lot of people read. Far more people read them than read most of the books that do get talked about. And I like his openness to reading the classics. But what about you? Are you the same way? So you read a couple of classics of either kind, ancient Greece and Rome, or just older than 3 generations, at school, and you've never done anything else? Never gone back to them? Or have classics been relevant to you? Have they spoken to you across the decades or the centuries or even the millennia? Even the millennia. 2 warriors on the plain of Troy, bodies flying in all directions, gore and viscera, which Homer describes in great detail for you. The dust of battle all around them. 2 warriors, one on one side, one on the other, consecrated to each other's destruction. But they suddenly realize in the midst of battle that they know each other, that they're friends. And they embrace there on the battlefield verbally. What a moment. If that doesn't work on you, or later on in the book when the greatest warrior of Troy has a respite from the battle for just a bit, goes into the city, meets his wife, and his little baby. And the little baby is terrified because of the enormous crest of his helmet. Because he's made the mistake, he's lost track of where he is. He's made the mistake of appearing in front of his little baby as a gigantic, remorseless engine of war. Someone who in the last hour has killed 30 people. That little moment is quintessentially human. It works now as well as it did 3,000 years ago. Do you have moments like that with classics? Have you had them? Or are you more along the lines of Kevin Toll, where most of those experiences are still in your future? You haven't had them. Or, and we might as well you might as well tell me, Father Confessor Steve, you might as well tell me, are you part of the group of readers? I know we have some, even on our little corner of BookTube. I know we do. Are you part of the group of readers who've sort of informally said in their head that they don't want anything to do with any kind of classic, either kind of classic, either ancient Greece and Rome or anything older than their parents? They've made a kind of conscious decision. I really don't want to read anything like that. It just doesn't. Nothing about that kind of writing does anything for me at all. Are you one of those readers? You can tell me. I won't be mad. I will be lamenting because that means you had bad teachers. Trust me, those books will work on you if you give them half a genuine chance. They will work on you. You will no longer feel that way. You will be reading something immediate. Absolutely immediate. You might think there's a whole thick layer of dust and inaccessibility laying over Dante's Inferno or Shakespeare's Othello, and you're wrong. Just plain wrong. It's not a matter of taste. Those works are alive. They're bursting with electricity. You give them half a chance, and you'll be affected by it. But maybe you haven't been, and now you think you will never be. Feel free to tell me. Tell me what your relationship with the classics is. And your idea of their relevance. I want to hear about it. Now, I'm going to link to Kevin's video down below because you should go and tell him too. But I want to know. I want to know. So, and his video leaves open the door for people to make video responses. So this is mine. So I'll wrap this up for now. Sorry for the length. I could go on forever talking on this subject, but I'll be back. Thank you.